The ancient wolf spirit rejected every noble daughter in the kingdom. It walked past the princess of the Eastern Reach. It walked past the alpha heirs, who had trained their whole lives for this moment. It walked past women who had been groomed, dressed, perfumed, and positioned since childhood to stand in that hall. And then it stopped. It turned away from all of them. And it crossed the great hall of Vethara slowly, deliberately, like something that had already made its decision long before tonight. It walked toward the back of the room, toward the shadows, toward the servant columns, toward a girl with a cracked boot and a water basin, and a black spiral mark on her wrist that the court said made her less than human. And in front of every noble, every lord, every alpha heir, every decorated daughter in the kingdom, the ancient wolf spirit bowed. The hall did not breathe. And the cursed girl whispered, "No, you have the wrong person." The spirit pressed its silver head harder against her chest. It did not agree. 3 days before that moment, Vesna Ashvin was scrubbing a floor that no one would notice. Vesna survived by thinking in small pieces. One task, 1 hour, one breath at a time. The moment she let the full shape of her life assemble itself, all at once, in one clear picture, it became a weight she could not carry and work at the same time. So she never let it assemble. She kept it in fragments: a dirty floor, a water basin, a corridor that needed mopping before the third bell. That was the whole shape of her world, and she held it there deliberately. She was 23 years old. She had been a servant in the great house of Vethara for 4 years. Before that, she had been a girl in a village too small to appear on important maps, with a mother who was a midwife and a father who had stopped coming home when she was 7. Before that, she had been ordinary. The mark had changed that. It appeared on the inside of her left wrist on the morning of her 19th birthday, a black spiral, precise and deep, the kind of mark that does not fade in sunlight and does not wash away with soap or effort. She had scrubbed it until her skin was raw. It stayed. She had gone to old Bryn, the village healer, with her wrist wrapped in cloth so no one in the lane would see. Bryn had unwrapped it, looked at it for a long time, said nothing. Then she had said, "Sit down, child." Vesna sat. "This is old blood," Bryn said. "Someone in your line made a bargain with a spirit they could not hold. The price passed down. It came to you." "What does it do?" Vesna asked. Bryn looked at her steadily. "It blocks the mate bond. Any bond that tries to form on you, the mark stops it. You will stand at every choosing fire, every ceremony, every rite, and you will feel nothing, and they will feel nothing, and you will be passed over every time." Vesna sat very still for a moment. Then she said, "Is there a way to break it?" Bryn looked at the mark. "One way, but it is not something I can give you. It can only come from something older than the curse itself." She paused. "And I do not know if such a thing still walks this world." Vesna walked home in the dark that evening. She did not cry. She did not have the space for it. At 20, she stood at the village choosing fire. The boy beside her reached for the bond, found nothing, looked at her with confused, quiet hurt, the way people look when they cannot understand what they are failing to feel. She walked home alone. She was not invited to another ceremony. At 21, she came to Vethara, not because she expected anything there, because the village had become a place where every face knew what she was and every conversation had an edge to it. She needed somewhere she could be nobody. Somewhere the mark was just a mark and not a verdict people read every morning. Vethara gave her that, in the worst possible way. She became invisible, truly, completely invisible, not seen and dismissed, simply not seen at all. 4 years of floors and basins and corridors, and the particular quality of existing in a room full of people who have decided you are furniture. She had made her peace with that. Or she had told herself she had, which was close enough most days. On the morning that everything changed, she was walking the Upper East Corridor with a message she had invented herself and a purposeful pace, because she had learned that a person walking with purpose and something in their hands was almost never stopped. She was passing the wine cellar entrance when she heard Lord Edric's youngest son, Felin, come around the corner. Felin was 17. He had the particular cruelty of boys who have never been told no by anyone who mattered. He stopped when he saw her. He smiled. "Still here, cursed girl." She kept her face flat, not cold. Cold invited a fight, flat was stone. Stone gave him nothing to push against. "My lord," she said, and moved to pass. He stepped sideways, blocked her. "I heard the ancient wolf spirit is coming," he said pleasantly. "The rite of calling, 3 days." He looked at her wrist, at the mark. "They say the spirit can smell a curse the moment it enters a room." He tilted his head. "You should stay in the cellar that day. It would be embarrassing for everyone if the spirit recoiled from you in public." She looked at him. She said nothing. The mark on her wrist was warm, the way it always went warm when she was afraid, though she had made a rule about not letting anyone see her afraid. "I will keep that in mind, my lord," she said. He let her pass because he was bored. She walked the length of the corridor with the flat, steady pace of someone who has decided cruelty does not get to live in their body after the person delivering it has moved on. At the end of the corridor, she pressed one hand flat against the cold stone of the wall and breathed. The rite of calling was in 3 days. The ancient wolf spirit, the ancestral guardian of the wolf bloodline, the entity that had chosen every Luna of consequence in the kingdom's recorded history, was coming to Vethara. 11 noble daughters from every reach of the 6 territories were already arriving. The great hall was being dressed in silver banners. The court was buzzing with it. Vesna had one plan for the ceremony. Stand behind the column at the back of the hall, hold the water basin, be forgotten. She would be forgotten. She had no idea the spirit had already been looking for her before it even arrived. She pressed her hand against the stone and breathed. And the mark on her wrist burned warm. And something in the hall above her, something that had not yet arrived but was already moving through the world toward this keep, turned its ancient attention in her direction. Talus Vane had not slept properly in a year. He sat at his war table at the second bell of the morning. Maps in front of him he was not reading, ale in his cup he was not drinking. One candle burning, the fire low. He had been king of the 6 reaches for 6 years. He had spent 4 of those years in a war that was not his making, and 2 years trying to rebuild what the war had left. He had watched good men die for decisions made by men who were already dead by the time the bill arrived. He did not talk about this. He managed it, which was different. Managing meant it stayed contained. Managed grief did not bleed into war councils or treaty negotiations or the careful political arithmetic of a kingdom held together by agreements that needed constant tending. He was good at managing. He was not good at sleeping. The problem, or one of the many problems, Talus was a man familiar with multiple simultaneous problems, was the bond. 6 years as king. No Luna. No mate bond confirmed. The spirit had not come in his father's final years, and then the war had swallowed everything, and now the war was over and the eastern reaches would not formally recognize his authority over the disputed territories without the Luna bond being sealed. Which meant the spirit had to come. Which meant the spirit had to choose. Lord Commander Sevek, who ran the guard and spoke his mind without dressing either in ceremony, had sat across this table 3 nights ago and said, plainly, "You need the spirit to choose someone, and you need it done before the first moon of winter or the Eastern Treaty falls apart." "I know," Talus said. "You know," said Sevek, "you have known for 6 years. The knowing hasn't produced a bond. The spirit comes when it comes." "The spirit," said Sevek, "has not manifested in 38 years. I have spoken to Chancellor Holt. There is a precedent for the spirit going silent, for walking through a hall and simply, he stopped." "Simply what?" "Not choosing anyone." The fire popped. Talus looked at the map that he was not reading. "Then we hold the ceremony correctly," he said. "We receive the daughters of the noble houses with the proper courtesy. We perform the rite exactly as the old texts prescribe, and whatever happens we deal with." Sevik exhaled through his nose. "And if it goes wrong?" Talus looked at him steadily. "Then we deal with that too." He said it the way he said most things at the end of the thought, when the thought had been all the way through him and come out the other side. Flat and final. The voice of a man who had run out of alternatives and made peace with that. What he did not say, what he did not permit himself to say, was this: that the bond space in his chest, the place where the mate thread was supposed to live, had always felt like an empty room. Not painful, not hollow, just waiting, as though something had always been about to arrive and had always been taking slightly longer than expected. He had stopped listening for it somewhere around the second year of the war. He had forgotten, in the noise of everything that needed managing, that it had ever been there at all. He would remember. In 3 days in the great hall he would remember what he had been waiting for. He would not be expecting it. He would not be ready. But the empty room in his chest had, apparently, been patient enough for both of them. Talus blew out the candle. He did not sleep. 3 floors below, in the east corridor, a girl with a mark on her wrist was pressing her hand against cold stone. Neither of them knew yet that the distance between them was about to become the most important distance in the kingdom. The noble daughters arrived across 2 days with noise and color, and the elaborate visibility of people who had been told this moment would define their lives. Vesna watched from the kitchen corridor window. She had stationed herself there on the pretext of carrying a message, a trick that was now 4 years old and still worked, because the person who might question it had never once truly looked at her. Lady Silvara of Crestwood came first, gold-haired, tall. She descended the carriage steps and looked at the great house of Vethara with the expression of someone appraising a property they expected to inherit. Her attendants moved around her like a tide. The Morath twins, Petra and Isolde, came in the second carriage, dark-haired, compact. They moved like women who had grown up running, and they arrived without display, which Vesna thought was probably more dangerous than display. Then the others, River Reach daughters, Stone Ridge daughters, Salt Coast daughters, all in good wool and careful composure. The last carriage arrived at dusk. The courtyard changed when it opened. Not because the woman inside was loud. She was, in fact, the quietest arrival of all, but the guards straightened. The head steward stopped walking and smoothed his coat. Even the torches seemed to adjust. Lady Asara of House Vane, the king's cousin, third removed. Beautiful the way old paintings of queens are beautiful, totally, and with full awareness of it. She looked at the courtyard with the expression of someone who has already decided a place is theirs before the paperwork is finished. Vesna watched from the window. From behind her, the head cook, Gareth, a solid woman who had been running this kitchen for 15 years and who had, without ever discussing it, started putting a second portion of supper in front of Vesna most nights, said. Counted them. 11, said Vesna. Gareth was quiet for a moment. Were they what you expected? Vesna thought about Silvara's appraising eyes, about Isara's quiet certainty. Some of them, she said. Gareth set a bowl of soup down without being asked. Vesna sat and ate. Around her the kitchen hummed, fire and bread and the particular warmth of a room full of practical work. She ate slowly, and the mark on her wrist was cool and she was invisible, and that was fine. That was still, some mornings, the best available fine. The ceremony was in 1 day. Her plan: stand behind the column, hold the basin, be no one. She did not know that in the great hall above her, servants were polishing the floor she had helped polish 3 days earlier, the exact floor the spirit would cross in 1 day's time. She did not know it was already walking toward her. The next morning, something happened that she had not been expecting. Felin found her again. This time in the kitchen corridor, in front of 3 other servants and one of Lady Silvara's attendants, who was passing with an armful of silk. He said it casually, loudly, the way people say things when they want an audience. "There is a cursed girl working in this kitchen," he announced to no one and everyone. "Cursed blood, blocked bond, the kind the spirit recoils from." He looked at Vesna with the pleasant face of someone who has decided cruelty is entertainment. Someone should probably tell the spirit to watch its step, in case it comes too close to the servant wing and gets contaminated. Silvara's attendant looked at Vesna with quick clinical distaste, then looked away. The other servants looked at the floor. Vesna looked at the pot she was carrying. She said nothing. She walked past him. Behind her, one of the younger kitchen girls whispered, low and uncomfortable, she should just leave. The spirit would rather dissolve than choose cursed blood. Vesna did not turn around. She set the pot down at the far end of the kitchen. She put her hands flat on the table. She counted to 10. She picked the pot back up. She was fine. She was always fine. She did not know that, in approximately 30 hours, every person in that corridor was going to remember this moment differently. The great hall of Vethara had never been more prepared. Silver banners from the rafters, candles in such numbers that the hall had no shadows, the floor polished to hold the light, 11 noble daughters in a curved line before the dais, each one in the color of their house, each one positioned by the master of ceremonies in the exact arrangement that tradition and precedence required. At the back of the hall, behind the great carved column where the shadows pooled deepest, Vesna Ashvin stood with a water basin on a shelf beside her and a cloth over her arm. She kept her breathing steady. She kept her eyes down. She watched the ceremony from the edges of her vision, the way she had watched everything for 4 years, sideways, peripherally, without committing to full attention, so that no one would look at her looking. Talus Vane entered from the left arch. Up close, closer than she had ever been, he was different than he appeared at distance. The weariness she had catalogued from the courtyard was visible in the precise way he held his jaw. But there was something else too. Something in the way his eyes moved across the hall, not with anticipation, with management. The eyes of a man who had already decided what was going to happen and was monitoring for deviations. He took the dais. Voraz, the keeper of rites, spoke the old words. The names of 11 generations of wolf blood. The ceremonial name of the spirit, not its true name, but the sound that called it the way a bell calls across a field. And then Voraz said the final words. And the hall went quiet. Not the quiet of people choosing silence. The quiet of air being gently, deliberately moved aside. The ancient wolf spirit came into the great hall of Vethara. It did not come through the doors. It came through the air itself. One moment the center of the hall was empty, the next moment it was occupied. Something enormous and silver and so deeply still that it made every other thing in the room look like it was shaking by comparison. It was larger than anything that had a right to exist indoors. Its coat was the silver of moonlight on water, not flat but living, shifting subtly with each slow breath. Its eyes were the color of all old things together, amber, gray, something beneath both that had no name in the common tongue. The hall held its breath. The spirit began to walk. It walked the line of daughters with the patient certainty of something that has already reviewed the list. It stopped before Lady Silvara of Crestwood. The hall leaned forward collectively. Silvara stood perfectly still, chin level, hands at her sides. She had practiced this moment. She had prepared for exactly this. The spirit considered her for a long, stretching moment. Then it stepped back. A ripple of sound through the court, quickly suppressed. The spirit moved to Petra of the Moraths, stopped. Petra held its gaze without blinking. The spirit looked at her for even longer than it had looked at Silvara. Then it stepped back. Isolde same, it stepped back. one by one, daughter by daughter. The spirit moved through the line with the unhurried certainty of something that knew exactly what it was looking for and knew, with equal certainty, that it had not found it yet. The tension in the hall climbed. Someone in the court murmured, low and frightened, "It has gone mad." Another voice, barely a whisper, "Has it ever done this before?" The spirit reached Lady Asara. The hall stopped breathing. Isara of House Vane stood in the center of the line with the calm certainty of a woman who has expected this her whole life. She inclined her head very slightly, as if to say, "Yes, I know, I am ready." The spirit looked at her. It looked at her for so long that the master of ceremonies took a small step forward, ready to speak. Then the spirit made a sound. Not a roar, not a ceremony sound, a low, resonant refusal, a sound that lived in the stones of the floor and traveled up through every person's feet and said, without words unmistakably, "No." Not her. The hall fractured. Several people spoke at once and then stopped. The master of ceremonies opened his mouth and closed it. On the dais, the king's jaw went to the careful holding position. Sevek, at his shoulder, put one hand on the pommel of his sword without drawing it. The spirit stepped back from Isara. It moved past the final daughters, past the last girl in the line. And it stood at the end of the row with every noble daughter of the 6 reaches behind it, and it turned its enormous silver head. And it began to walk toward the back of the hall. A lord near the front said, low and disbelieving, "Where is it going?" A woman's voice from the second row, "There's no one back there, that's the servant section." Another voice, sharp with something between fear and contempt, "The spirit has gone mad. I told you, it has been too long, it has forgotten how to choose." The spirit did not stop. It walked toward the shadows, toward the column. Vesna had been watching from the edges of her vision. She saw the spirit turn. She saw it begin to move. She registered, with the slow, cold drop of a person watching something unstoppable heading toward them, that it was coming toward her side of the hall. Move, she thought, you need to move. You are in the way, step sideways, step. But her feet did not move, because the spirit was already there. It stood in front of her column, silver and enormous, its eyes level with her face. Up close it smelled of winter and something beneath winter, ancient, clean, like stone that has been cold for centuries and remembers it. Its eyes, up close, were looking at her with a complete, undiverted attention that she had never in her life been given by anything. She felt the mark on her wrist flare. Not the afraid warmth. Something she had never felt before. A recognition, a lock hearing the right key after years of wrong ones. "No," she whispered, her voice was barely sound. "No, you have the wrong person, I have a mark, I am cursed. I cannot hold a bond, there is a spiral on my wrist and it blocks everything. I have been blocked for 4 years. You cannot choose me, you have the wrong." The ancient wolf spirit lowered its enormous silver head. It pressed its forehead against her chest, right above her heart. Then it folded its 4 legs beneath itself and knelt at her feet. The water basin fell off the shelf. It hit the polished stone floor of the great hall of Vethara, and the sound it made was very small and very large at the same time. The hall was not breathing. And then every head turned toward the back of the room. Every lord, every noble daughter, every guard. Silvara, with her perfect composure, had gone still in a way that composure does not cover. Petra of the Moraths was staring with her mouth not quite closed. Lady Asara stood in the center of the line and watched the spirit kneeling before a servant girl with no expression on her face at all, which was, of the faces in the room, the most interesting one. Phelan, standing at the edge of the court near his father, said out loud what several people were thinking. "That girl is cursed." No one answered him. Vesna stood with her back against the column and her hand on the spirit's silver head. She did not remember raising her hand, but it was there, and the mark on her wrist was doing something it had never done. It was singing. Not a sound, A vibration, internal and warm and unlike anything she had ever felt from it. The Keeper of Rites, Voras, recovered his voice. He said, in the tone of a man reciting something he had always believed was theoretical, in a hall that was not ready to hear it. The ancient wolf spirit has chosen. A woman in the third row said, in a voice pitched for her neighbor but loud enough for half the hall. It bowed to her. It bowed to a servant. Someone else, she is cursed. The mark is right there on her wrist. Everyone can see it. And then a voice near the front, Felans again, because he had not learned anything from the last 5 minutes. The spirit would rather bow to cursed blood than choose any of them. It has gone completely mad. On the dais, Talus Vane was already moving. He came down from the throne in 3 strides, crossed the dais, and walked the length of the hall without urgency and without hesitation. The crowd parted without deciding to. He came to the column. He looked at the spirit kneeling at the girl's feet. Then he looked at her. She looked back at him. She had nothing left to do except look back. He said, "What is your name?" Lo, a room voice, not the ceremony voice, the underneath voice. "Vesna Ashvin," she said. "I carry the water basins. I was not supposed to be here. I know I was not supposed to be here. I was behind the column." "You were exactly where you were supposed to be," he said. She stared at him. "The mark," he said. "Tell me about the mark." She pulled her sleeve back. The spiral was dark and warm and singing. "It is a curse," she said. "Old blood, a debt from my ancestors. It blocks the bond. It has blocked every bond for 4 years. I cannot hold a mate connection. Your spirit has made an error." She said it plainly, without drama, because she had spent 4 years being precise about what she was, and old habits did not dissolve in 30 seconds. Talus looked at the mark for a long moment. Then he said very quietly, "And yet." She swallowed, "And yet." Behind him, the hall was still watching, still buzzing, still rearranging itself around an event it had no framework for. Voras arrived at the king's shoulder and said, with the controlled urgency of a man managing a sacred ceremony that has just stepped outside every precedent in his library, "Your Majesty, the spirit has rendered a verdict. The law is clear. We must." "I know the law," said Talus. He did not look away from Vesna. "We move to the council chamber. Bring her, bring the spirit." He looked at Sevik. "Clear the hall. The daughters are guests. Treat them accordingly." Sevik moved. Vesna stood where she was. "My lord," she said carefully, "I am a kitchen servant with a curse. I am not the kind of person this ceremony produces." "Evidently," said Talus, "you are exactly that person." He looked at the spirit still kneeling at her feet, "and I would very much like to understand why." The spirit rose. It pressed its head briefly against Vesna's hip. Then it walked toward the side corridor, calm and unhurried, and waited. Vesna looked at the water basin on the floor. Then she looked at the king. She went. Behind her, in the great hall, Lady Asara of House Vane stood in the center of the line of noble daughters, and looked at the column where a cursed servant girl had just been knelt before by an ancient spirit. Her face did something her training had not prepared it to do. She let it. They brought her to the inner council chamber. High ceilings, old wood, the smell of serious conversations layered over years. The spirit settled on the stone floor near her chair and put its great head on its paws. The room arranged itself around her presence with the awkward care of furniture that has not been used for this purpose before. Talus sat across from her without ceremony. Sevik stood at the door. Chancellor Holt arrived, slightly breathless, with parchment he was still carrying from whatever he had been doing when summoned. "The court," said Holt, setting the parchment down, "is in 4 conversations. One about the legitimacy of the choosing, one about the mark, one about Lady Asara, and one about you." He looked at Vesna, in roughly equal proportion. "What is the conversation about me?" she asked. "Who you are," he said. where you came from, and whether this is some kind of," he paused, choosing the diplomatic word, "irregularity." "Tell them," said Vesna, "that I was carrying a water basin." Holt blinked. "That is what I was doing when the spirit found me." She said, "I was behind the column with a water basin. That is the full extent of my involvement in this." She looked at the king. "I did not position myself. I did not arrange anything. I did not know this was possible. I thought the mark made me untouchable by anything with a bond." "Tell me about the mark," said Talus. She told him, Old Bryn, the morning the spiral appeared, the choosing fire at 20, the 4 years at Vethara. She told it in the flat, careful way she had practiced, the way that kept it contained, the way that did not require her to feel it while she was saying it. He listened, he did not interrupt. When she finished, he said, "And Old Bryn told you there was one way to break it." "Something older than the curse itself," said Vesna. Holt made a sound. Everyone looked at him. "Your Majesty," he said slowly, with the expression of a scholar who has just connected a source he read 3 years ago to a situation he is currently standing in. "I need to go to the archive." "Now," said Sevik. "Preferably immediately." Talus looked at him. "Go, come back with whatever you find." Holt left at something approaching a run, which Vesna had not yet seen a chancellor do. The room was quiet. Vesna sat with her hands flat on her knees, and the spirit breathing steadily beside her chair, and the singing in her wrist that had not stopped since the hall. Talus said, "Are you afraid?" She thought about that honestly. "I am afraid of being wrong," she said, "of the spirit having made an error and everyone in the 6 reaches having to manage the consequence of that." She paused. "I am not afraid of you. I do not know why that is. I thought I would be." "Is that unusual, not being afraid of me?" "Most people in this keep are afraid of you." "Yes," he said simply, "I know." She looked at him. The gray eyes were steady. The jaw was not in the careful holding position. Something had loosened slightly in the last few minutes. She was not sure when it had happened. "Who taught you to carry pain this quietly?" he said. She had not expected that, not at all. She looked at her hands. "Practice," she said. "You have been practicing for a long time." 4 years. Longer than that, I think. She did not answer, because he was right, and she was not ready to confirm that in a room with people in it. The spirit lifted its head and made the low, settled hum. Warm. Content. The sound of something that has arrived at the correct location after a long journey. Vesna felt the hum travel from the spirit's chest through the air and into her ribs and settle there. She told herself it was the spirit. She was not entirely right. Holt came back 40 minutes later. He came back at speed with a text so old, the parchment was nearly transparent. He was pale. He said, "Your Majesty, I know who she is." The room went still. "Not who she is now," he said, "who she has always been. I know why the spirit came to Vethara tonight. I know why it waited 38 years. He looked at Vesna. His voice was careful, the voice of a man delivering a thing he has only just finished believing himself. And it was never waiting for a ceremony. Holt set the text on the table. He translated it in his careful scholar's voice, haltingly, because the language was old and required thought between each sentence. The story it told was this. 4 generations back, in the winter that destroyed 3 villages in the northern Ashfin territory, a winter so severe that people starved inside their homes, a woman named Ashfin had made a bargain. Not with the ancient wolf spirit itself. With a lesser spirit of the old reach, a spirit of warmth and passage. She had asked for safe passage for her children through the killing cold, for enough warmth to survive until spring, for food when the stores ran out. The lesser spirit agreed. The price was the first bond of her bloodline for 3 generations. She paid it. Her children survived. The village survived. She died at 47 without ever knowing whether she had made the right choice, because right choices and necessary ones are not always the same thing. The bond price passed to her children, and to their children, and to their children's children. And the ancient wolf spirit, the oldest entity in the six reaches, the one that had made the original pact framework that all such bargains operated within, had known. It had known from the moment the bargain was struck that the debt was coming toward it eventually, that 3 generations of blocked bonds would end when someone carried the mark to a place where the spirit could collect what was owed and pay back what it had always owed in return. Because the lesser spirit, when it made the bargain with the Ashvin woman, had used the wolf spirit's framework without permission, the debt ran 2 directions. The spirit didn't come tonight to choose a Luna, said Holt quietly. He looked at Vesna. It came to honor a debt. The Ashvin woman saved her children. The cost passed down to you. You have been carrying it faithfully for 4 years without being broken by it. The spirit has been, he stopped, took a breath. It has been waiting for a member of her line to arrive at a place where it had authority, where it could resolve the debt, lift the mark, pay what was owed. He paused. It has been waiting since before you were born. The room was very still. Vesna looked at the text, at the nearly transparent parchment with its careful old handwriting. She thought about her great-great-grandmother in a killing winter, feeding her children in the dark. She thought about the choice she had made, not from greed, not from ambition, from the oldest, simplest human reason. Because they were cold. She felt something move in her chest that was not the mark, and was not the spirit's hum. She pressed her hand flat on the table. She did not know, Vesna said. She did not know what she was passing down. No, said Holt gently. She only knew her children needed warmth. And the mark was her great-great-granddaughter's to carry. The mark, said Holt, was the spirit's way of finding you, not a punishment, a thread, leading the right person to the right place at the right time. Vesna was quiet for a long moment. It led me to a water basin, she said. It led you, said Talus quietly, to a keep where an ancient spirit could find you, and to a ceremony where it could reach you in front of witnesses. He looked at her steadily. The path was never glamorous, but it was never accidental. She looked at the mark. The spiral was still dark, still singing, but she heard it differently now. Not a seal on a shut door. A thread drawn taut, finally reaching its end. Can it be lifted? She said. The spirit will lift it, said Voras from the corner where he had been silent for the last 20 minutes. That is what tonight was, the beginning of the lifting. It cannot be done in one moment, not for a debt this old, but the spirit has initiated it. He looked at the creature lying at Vesna's feet. That is what the kneeling means. It was not only choosing a Luna, it was acknowledging a debt it owes to her blood. He paused. The choosing and the debt honoring have become the same act. Because she was the right person for both. Vesna sat with that for a long time. Then she said, I was not looking for this. I know, said Talus. I was not positioning myself. I was not being strategic. I know that too. I genuinely was just carrying a water basin. The king looked at her for a moment, and then he did something she had not seen him do in the 2 hours she had known him. He laughed. It was quiet and short and completely real. I know, he said, and I think that is precisely the point. That night they gave her a room with a window that faced east. The sheets smelled of cedar. The fire had been laid and lit before she arrived. The room was warm and clean and hers. Vesna stood in the center of the carpet for nearly a full minute before she could make her body sit down on the bed. The spirit went around the room first, inspecting the corners, the hearth, the threshold, and then lay across the doorway with its great silver back to the room. She understood immediately. She was being guarded. She had not been guarded by anything in 4 years. She sat on the bed and put her face in her hands and breathed. The mark on her wrist pulsed once, warm and certain. And somewhere in the keep, 3 corridors and 2 staircases away, the same warmth moved through Talus Vane's chest as he sat at his Cold War table. He put one hand flat over his sternum. He sat like that for a long time. He did not know yet what to call it. But the empty room in his chest was no longer empty. The first complication arrived before breakfast. Lady Asara of House Vane came to the council chamber alone. Without attendants, which Vesna had already learned was not how Asara moved through space. She sat across from Vesna without being invited and looked at the mark on her wrist for a long moment. Then she said, without preamble, "I want to understand what I saw last night." "I am also trying to understand it," said Vesna honestly. "The spirit knelt before you." "Yes." "It passed me." "Yes." Isara was quiet. Then, "I want to tell you something that is not going to leave this room." Vesna waited. "I was furious last night," said Isara. "I have spent my entire life being the most prepared person for every room I walked into, the most qualified, the most ready, and I have never once been chosen for anything that mattered." Her voice was even, controlled. "I was furious." "That seems reasonable," said Vesna. "I am also aware that fury is not the same as correctness." Isara looked at her. "I had prepared questions for a schemer, someone who had positioned herself near the spirit on purpose, someone clever and calculating who had worked the angles." She studied Vesna's face. "Those questions are not useful here." "I am not clever," said Vesna. "You are," said Isara, "just not the kind I prepared for." Vesna paused. "May I ask you something?" "Yes." "When you were in the hall, when the spirit passed you, what did you feel?" Isara was still for a long time, longer than the question required. The stillness of someone searching for the honest answer rather than the acceptable one. "Relief," she said at last, underneath the fury. She looked out the window. "I did not want him. I had agreed to want him because the alternative was political instability, but I had not wanted him, and the spirit walked past me and said, without words, 'No, not this, not for either of you.'" She looked back at Vesna. "I am going to go home. My father will be unhappy. There will be implications, but I want you to know something before I go." Vesna waited. "I think the spirit was right," said Isara quietly. "I would have been very competent at being Luna. I would have managed it well, and it would have been the wrong kind of well." She stood. "Be kind to him. He has been carrying this kingdom alone for 6 years, and he has carried it without anyone noticing what it costs him. Be kind to him. That is all." She left. Vesna sat in the council chamber for a long time with the spirit at her feet and the cooling tea in her hands. She understood she had just been given something. Not the ceremony, not the position. Something simpler and harder to name than either. She had been truly seen by someone who had every reason not to bother. She did not have the word for what that was. She kept it anyway. The second complication arrived at midday. It came in the form of a folded letter on the king's war table, sealed with the Eastern Reach's mark. Talus read it once. Then he looked at Vesna. He said, "Someone wants to take the spirit from you." "They cannot take." "They have a compound," he said, "old formula, binding smoke derived from ironwood ash and a deep quarry mineral that suppresses the spirit's physical form." He set the letter down. "And it is not the spirit they are primarily targeting." He turned the letter so she could see the last line, written in a different hand from the rest. Small, precise, certain of itself. It said, "The girl's mark can be restored. We have the texts. All it requires is a conversation." Vesna read it twice. The mark on her wrist burned. Lord Fenric Roth of the Eastern Reach. Holt said it in the council chamber that evening, with the measured calm of a man who has been dreading this particular name in this particular context for some time. Roth controlled 3 of the 6 Eastern territories. His recognition of the Luna Bond was not optional under the treaty law. Without it, the Eastern Compact fell apart, the disputed territories became disputed again, and everything the last 6 years of careful reconstruction had built went with them. "He sent a polite letter," said Talus, "with an impolite addendum." He wants his daughter placed, said Sevik flatly. He offered her 2 years ago. She was declined because the spirit had not manifested. Now it has manifested and chosen someone his system cannot accommodate, and he is offering again. He is threatening to recurse me, said Vesna. He is demonstrating, said Talus, with the precision of someone choosing between synonyms very carefully, that he has the means to interfere with the spirit's choice. That is the same thing. Yes, said Talus, it is. Tell me about his daughter, said Vesna. The room paused. Her name is Vara, said Holt, 24, educated entirely at the Roth estate under tutors her father approved. She is, by most accounts, not unkind. He stopped. She is. She has no choices, said Vesna. Holt was quiet. He is threatening me with a girl who has been given no choices in her life, said Vesna. I want that kept in mind when we decide what to do about him. I do not want anything that harms her. The room was still. Talus looked at her across the table. The gray eyes were doing the thing she was beginning to learn to read, the shift that happened in them when he was revising something he had previously understood, updating a calculation, incorporating new information. He said noted and agreed. Then he turned to Sevik. I want Roth's people in this keep identified by nightfall, guards on irregular schedules, anyone with Eastern connections outside the official delegation. I want to know who has been bought and when. And Roth himself, said Sevik. Roth himself goes through the Treaty Council. His concern about recognition has legal standing. We give it a legitimate hearing. A pause. But we give it from a position of knowing everything he has, not from surprise. He looked at Vesna. I want you moved to the Eastern Tower, higher up the keep, better guarded. I would prefer, she said carefully, not to be moved somewhere that looks like hiding. He considered that for exactly as long as it deserved. The Eastern Tower has windows on 3 sides and an unobstructed view of the outer yard. It does not look like hiding. It looks like placement. All right, she said, the Eastern Tower. The spirit rose from the floor and stretched, a long, leisurely, enormous motion, then pressed its head briefly against Vesna's shoulder. Every person in the room watched it. I think it agrees with the tower, said Vesna. And for the second time in 2 days, the king laughed, quiet and short and real. And the empty room in his chest was warmer than it had been yesterday. They found Roth's man on the evening of the 2nd day. His name was Tiven, a guard, 3 years at Vethara, sending messages east through the laundry route. He talked before Sevik had finished explaining what cooperation meant for his future. He described the plan in the flat, honest voice of a man who knows the arithmetic has turned against him. 3 men, binding smoke. The night before the formal recognition ceremony, the spirit's physical form dissolved. The bond collapsed. Vesna reduced to a servant girl with an old mark and no legal standing. Vara Roth offered as the alternative. Sevik looked at the king. The king looked at Vesna. We were ready, said Talus. That is what matters. We were ready because Tiven talked, said Vesna, and Tiven talked because someone was listening in the right places. She paused. I want his name kept out of the reports. Sevik frowned. He betrayed. He made a choice under pressure that cost him more than it gained him, said Vesna, and his information is more valuable to us alive and trusted than dead and silent. She looked at Sevik steadily. If we protect him, he keeps talking. If we expose him, Roth knows we have a source and burns every bridge between here and the Eastern Reach. Sevik was quiet. He looked at the king. She is right, said Talus. Do it her way. Sevik exhaled slowly through his nose. The exhale of a man who has spent 30 years running a guard and has just been outmaneuvered on a point of tradecraft by a former kitchen servant. He did it her way. The night of the 7th day was cold and clear. The moon was full. It threw shadows from the battlements across the inner yard in long, sharp lines. Vesna was in the eastern tower with the spirit at her feet and the window open, because she slept better with cold air, a habit from 4 years in servant quarters where warmth was not reliable, and she had learned to prefer the temperature she could count on. She was not asleep. She was sitting at the window with her hand on the spirit's back, watching the yard below, when the mark on her wrist changed. Not warm, not singing. A warning, a sudden cold contraction like a held breath. She stood up. She went to the door. She opened it and said to the guard on the corridor, "Something is at the water gate." The guard looked at her. "My lady, it is the second bell. No movement has been." "Something is at the water gate," she said again. "Please tell Lord Commander Sevik." The guard had been placed there by Sevik personally, which meant he had been told to take her seriously. He moved. What followed was over in less than 12 minutes. Roth's 3 men came in through the water gate. The guard rotation they had been given was 3 days old. The rotation had been changed. Sevik's people were already there in the dark without torches. The binding smoke never left the clay jar. 2 of Roth's men were taken. The 3rd went over the north wall. Sevik led him. A man running back to Roth with the news that the attempt had failed was more useful than a man silenced. Roth would know by morning that Vithara had been ready. He would not know how. Vesna had insisted on that specifically in the eastern tower at the 3rd bell of the night, while the spirit lay across the threshold and the moon threw its cold light through the 3-sided windows. She had thought it through, not in the systematic way of a trained strategist, but in the patient, lateral way of someone who has spent 4 years listening to what rooms are not saying. A man who does not know which of his pieces has turned cannot trust any of his pieces. A man who cannot trust his pieces cannot coordinate. A man who cannot coordinate sends polite letters, and polite letters could be answered in the Treaty Council where Talus had the advantage of legitimate standing. The threat had a shape now, and the shape had a weakness, and the weakness had been found not by a guard or a chancellor but by a girl who had survived 4 years by paying attention to things no one thought she was watching. When Sevik reported to the king at dawn, he told him the water gate had been secured and the binding smoke had been neutralized. Talus said, "How did we know they were coming?" Sevik paused. "Vesna," he said, "the mark warned her." Talus looked at the report for a moment. "Add it to the protocol," he said. "If the mark reacts, we respond, immediately, no waiting for confirmation." Sevik made a notation. She also, Sevik added carefully, correctly identified the strategic value of letting the 3rd man escape. Talus looked at him. "She thought faster than most of my commanders," said Sevik, flatly, as a statement of record, without ego and without pleasure. "I thought you should know." Talus said nothing, but the empty room in his chest moved again, warmer still. Roth's 2nd move came 3 days later. He did not send men this time. He sent a formal complaint to the Treaty Council, arguing that the Luna bond formed on a cursed bloodline of no noble house and no territorial standing was invalid under old pack law, and requesting a formal review before the recognition ceremony proceeded. The council convened. Vesna attended, not as a witness, as the respondent. She had asked to speak herself. Talus had agreed, which had made Holt nervous and Sevik cautious, and the assembled council uncertain in the specific way of people who have not yet recalibrated their expectations. She stood before the council table. She was wearing the green dress. She said, "Lord Roth argues that my bloodline has no noble standing. He is correct. My family is from a village that does not appear on important maps. My mother was a midwife. My father did not stay. I have been a kitchen servant in this house for 4 years." She paused. "He argues that the curse on my bloodline disqualifies me from the Luna bond under old pack law. He is citing the Holloway provision of the 3rd treaty consolidation, which states that a blocked bond cannot form the basis of a recognized Luna bond. She paused again. The Holloway provision applies to bonds that were blocked by outside interference after the choosing. It does not apply to bonds that predate the choosing. The ancient wolf spirit did not choose me and then discover the mark. It chose me because of the mark. Because of what the mark represents, a blood debt being honored across 4 generations. The spirit's choosing is not the formation of a bond in the Holloway sense. It is the resolution of a debt that predates the treaty consolidation by 200 years. She looked at the council. If Roth wishes to argue that the spirit's authority over old blood debt is invalid, he is welcome to make that argument. But he should understand that he is not arguing against me. He is arguing against the ancient wolf spirit itself. The council was quiet. An old lord near the end of the table said slowly, "Where did you learn the Holloway provision?" "The archive," said Vesna. "3 nights ago I could not sleep." The old lord looked at Holt. Holt looked at his parchment. "She is correct," he said, "on all 3 counts." Roth's formal complaint was dismissed before sundown. Vesna walked back to the eastern tower. She sat on the window seat with the spirit's head in her lap. She was shaking slightly, the delayed physical response of a body that had been holding itself together in a council chamber for 40 minutes. She pressed her back against the stone and breathed. When Talus came to the tower that evening, he brought no report and no council matter. He just came. He sat across from her. He said, "You have spent years surviving alone, haven't you?" She looked at him. "Yes," she said. "And you carried it without making it the loudest thing about you." She was quiet for a moment. "What else do you do with it?" she said. "You carry it, that is what carrying means." He looked at her for a long time. Then he said, "I would like to stop you from having to do it alone." She held his gaze. The mark on her wrist was still and warm. The spirit between them made the low, settled hum. "All right," she said. It was the most important all right she had ever said. The formal recognition ceremony was not what the court expected. It was not in the Great Hall. Vesna had asked for the inner courtyard, the same courtyard where she had stood at the corridor window counting 11 carriage arrivals and telling herself she was fine, that she was no one, that the ceremony above her head would not touch her. Talus had said yes without asking why. She had not explained, but she thought he understood anyway, which was itself a thing she was still getting used to being understood before the explanation arrived. The morning was pale and cold with the particular clarity of a sky that has been washed clean overnight. The courtyard stones were damp. The first light was thin and gold and low. Sella, who had been assigned to dress her, arrived at the eastern tower at the first bell with a dress of deep forest green. "He chose this," Vesna said. "He said the lady should be dressed as herself," reported Sella. "He said himself required color. He said white was for ceremonies and you had already had yours." Vesna stood very still for a moment. Then she let Sella help her into the dress. She braided her own hair. Not the noble style, the border village braid she had worn since childhood. Simple and exact, the braid of a woman who knows her own hands and does not require help for the things she can do herself. She left the inside of her left wrist bare. The mark was different this morning. Not gone, she had not wanted it gone, had whispered this to the spirit in the dark 3 nights ago, and the spirit had made the agreement hum. But the black spiral had softened at its edges. Lighter, less like a seal, more like a signature, the mark of something that had been carried honestly across a long distance and had arrived at the place it was meant to arrive. She walked down from the eastern tower with the spirit at her left side. The corridor guards straightened as she passed. The hall staff stepped aside. She moved through the keep she had scrubbed and carried and made herself invisible in for 4 years, and this time people looked at her, directly, with the full weight of a face behind it. She held the looking and kept walking. In the courtyard, Voraz waited near the old well. Holt stood beside him. Sevik was there, arms crossed, face in the professional neutral position that meant he was hiding something that might be feeling. Gareth from the kitchen stood at the far edge with her arms folded, and her chin lifted in the way she held her chin when she was refusing to be visibly emotional about something. Isara was there. She had come back from the beginning of her journey home the moment the letter about the recognition ceremony had reached her. She stood near the front in her dark blue dress, steady and straight. And when Vesna passed her, she looked at Vesna with the settled directness of someone who has finished their calculation and is at peace with the result. And Talus was there. Not in the ceremonial coat, not in the heavy silver circlet. In a plain dark shirt with the sleeves pushed up and the iron circlet, the working one, the plain one, and his hands at his sides. He had chosen the iron on purpose. She was certain of it. He watched her walk across the courtyard with an expression she had learned to read over the last 7 days. Not management, not the underneath face. A third face she was still cataloging. The face that existed only in the space between him and her, when no one else required his attention and the performance of managing was set down temporarily. She arrived in front of him. The spirit moved to stand slightly behind her, a silver presence at her back. Voraz spoke the words. Shorter this morning. The formal ceremony was for the summoning of the spirit, and the spirit was already here. What remained was simpler. The recognition of the choosing. The acknowledgement of the old blood debt, he said it clearly, so that every person in the courtyard and the watching court beyond could hear. That the mark on the chosen Luna's wrist was recognized as faithfulness under burden. Not a stain. Not a disqualification, evidence. Then he said the last part. The part Holt had added at Talus's instruction, and that neither of them had told Vesna was coming. He said, let it be known across the 6 reaches that the ancient wolf spirit of Ethara chose in full knowledge of the mark. It chose not despite the burden, but because of the bearing of it. The chosen is recognized not by blood of the nobility, but by something older than nobility, the faithfulness of someone who carried a debt not her own and did not break under it. The courtyard was quiet. The mark on Vesna's wrist went still. Not the afraid still, not the warning still. The still of something that has been waiting for a long time and has, at last, been recognized. The singing stopped. Not because it was over, because it had become so constant it had turned into silence. The way a heartbeat is silent because it is always there. She pressed her hand flat over her wrist. Talus stepped down from the small raised step. He stood in front of her. He said, in the voice that was not the ceremony voice and not the war council voice but the third voice, "How are you?" She almost laughed. She let it come this time brief and real and warm. "Present," she said. "That is the best I have right now." "That is enough," he said. "That is, in fact, everything." He held out his hand. She looked at it. She thought about the choosing fire at 19, the hand beside hers that had felt nothing. She thought about 4 years of corridors and water basins and cultivating invisibility because it was the only safe option. She thought about an enormous silver spirit pressing its forehead to her chest, in a hall full of people who had already decided she was nothing. She put her hand in his. The mark on her wrist, the spiral her great-great-grandmother had carried into a killing winter, that had passed through 4 generations of her blood, that had sat on her skin for 4 years and blocked every bond and every connection and every thread, went entirely, finally still. Present settled hers. The spirit made a sound. The high, clear note of something recognized, something completed, something very old being at last put down. Gareth, at the back of the courtyard, made a sound that was officially not a sob. Nobody argued with her about it. Voraz raised his hands and spoke the last words of the recognition. And the 6 reaches had their Luna. Vesna is in the archive most mornings. She goes before the council meets, with a pot of tea and the spirit at her feet and the quarterly letters she composes to all 6 reaches. She has developed, in 3 years, a second current of information running alongside the official reports, something informal, something human, something that tells the council not what the reaches are reporting but what the reaches are actually feeling. The council has learned to treat it as the more reliable of the two. The mark on her wrist is pale now, still visible, always. She does not cover it but soft at the edges, the signature of something carried faithfully and set down at the right time. There is a boy now, named Edwin, for no ancestor and no title, because she and Talus had agreed that he would be permitted to be himself first and a wolf second, and a name without weight was the beginning of that. Edwin is 2.5. He has his father's gray eyes and his mother's quiet mouth and an absolutely fearless relationship with the spirit, who follows him through the corridors of Vethara with the devoted patience of something that has decided this small person is the most important work it has. Talus comes into the archive at the second bell with a report from the Eastern Reach. He has already read it. Vara has finalized the rotation, he says. Permanent seats for the Eastern delegates from the next quarter. Good, says Vesna without looking up. He sits across from her. The spirit opens one eye, decides the arrival is acceptable, closes it again. They work in the same room for a while, the way people work together when they have done it long enough for the silence to be comfortable and the interruptions to be welcome. He says, I want to go to the Highland water territories before winter. I want to go in 3 weeks, she says, after the Salt Coast report comes in. 3 weeks, he agrees. Bring Holt. He has been trying to get to the Northern Archive for 2 years and he will not ask. I'll tell him it's mandatory. Tell him it was my idea. He'll be pleased. Talus smiles. The real one. The small, contained smile that is not for the court or the council, but only for rooms like this one. Vesna goes back to her letter. He goes back to his report. Edwin is asleep upstairs. The spirit is breathing. The morning light comes through the high archive window in the slow gold way of late autumn, the kind of light that does not arrive quickly but stays once it comes. Later, she will walk the keep. She will stop in the kitchen and sit with Gareth for the half hour they have sat together most evenings for 3 years, because Gareth knows the keep in ways no report captures, and because the kitchen smells of bread and fire, and because some things a person needs are not on any official list and never will be. But that is later. For now, she writes her letter. He reads his report. The spirit breathes, and the pale spiral on her wrist catches the morning light. Not in a flash. In the slow, certain glow of something with real depth, the kind that takes a moment to notice, and then, once noticed, you cannot look away from. Because it did not arrive easily. Because it was carried. Because the woman wearing it walked through 4 years of corridors no one noticed, and a ceremony she was not supposed to be in, and a kingdom that had decided before she arrived what she was worth. And she did not become what they decided. She became what the ancient spirit already knew she was. The kind of person who carries a debt that is not theirs without breaking. The kind of person who stands behind a column with a water basin and still does not look away. The kind of person worth waiting 38 years for. The 6 Reaches did not yet fully know her name when the story began. They know it now. They will know it longer. Some endings are quiet like that. Until next time.